Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. Today, we're talking about The Witcher Season 2, currently airing on Netflix. At Rotten Tomatoes, the Tomato Meter score is 93%, and the critics' consensus reads, The Witcher's second season expands on its first in all the best ways, and most importantly, it remains a whole lot of fun. My guest today is Romain Lacourbas, cinematographer for the series. Romain, welcome to Below the Line.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Glad you're here, Romain. Listeners, we're going to explicitly spoil Witcher Season 2 and maybe accidentally spoil Season 1, so please catch up before going further. But before we get there, Romain, talk to me about your early career and starting out in the business.
Sure. I started on a French cinema school for a couple of years in Paris, France, and then I got the great chance to be hired as a trainee on a French movie directed by Jean-François Stévenin and photographed by Pierre Haïm, who is well known for The Hate, directed by Mathieu Kassovitz. And then I spent quite a few years alongside with him, learning, being a camera assistant. So I was first a second AC, obviously, and then became a first AC. And then he offered me some camera operator on the camera positions. And then, I was working alongside with other DPs at the same time on other features, obviously. And at the same time, in between two features, I was trying to do some shorts as a DP, and which was a great opportunity to be able to, work as an AC on a feature and being a DP on shorts pretty much at the same time, because you basically apply what you learned a few weeks before, or you try to. And then I met Lola Doyon, who we did a few shorts together. She offered me to be her DP on her first feature, which was extremely generous from her because it was really the first feature for pretty much everyone. I started doing a little bit of commercials and video clips, and that's pretty much when I met Oliver Mégaton and then Luc Besson, and Oliver offered me to be the DP of Colombiana, which was my first big project, huge project for me at that time. That gave me access to the American cinema industry and the international features and narrative in general.
Romain, going back to the beginning, I get asked often by people who want to start out in film about the value of film school versus going to work on set. And honestly, I tell them neither one is going to be a guaranteed path. It really is a match for what they find. But I'm curious to hear more about your decision to, having started school, to actually leave and pursue this opportunity as a camera trainee. Did you know that camera was what you wanted to do when you were in school, or did the experience itself sell you on that path?
To be very honest with you, when I entered film school, I wanted to be a director, which is most of what the kids want to do when they enter, cinema school. I was about 19, 20 years, and all I wanted to do is directing. So no, I didn't know I was going to go towards the camera path. But one thing that cinema school taught me is that to become a director, you need to have something to say. And it also gave me the ability to discover what you can do and what you can tell with the camera. So that's the main thing for me that the cinema school gave me. Having said that, as you said, I don't think there is a unique way to enter the cinema. There's obviously multiples. For me, I think being on a set is much more valuable because that's where, it's like the fastest way to learn, and it's fun, and it's, you're just fascinated by all that energy and all that creative brains that are making stuff and the teamwork. So for me, being on a set is much more efficient than going through the cinema school. Having said that, I might not have chosen the best cinema school in the world, so I think it really depends. The action is always preferable, I think.
I know what you mean. Well, jumping us forward then, talk to me about joining the team for The Witcher in Season 2.
To tell you the truth, I think my dear friend, Sean Guest, who's first AD and also associate producer on The Witcher, he introduced me to Lauren, Lauren Ishmit, the showrunner of The Witcher, on season one. And she interviewed me. We had a very nice video call. And afterward, she offered me to be part of season one. At this time, I was still shooting on 000, and we had quite a few issues on that shoot. Andrea Riseborough, like, had an injury on her leg, so we had to stop for a few weeks, and the end of the shoot got postponed for a few months. Anyway, bottom line is I had to turn down, unfortunately, season one, and I finished 000. And then a few months before season one came out, those guys called me again and offered me season two, and I was extremely glad, and I obviously said yes. And I was super glad that they remembered me a year after.
Now, I noticed looking at the Witcher production crew, they do what a lot of shows do these days, where there's actually two directors of photography that are rotating episodes. Although I noticed on season two, you did episodes 1, 2, 5, and 8, which is an unusual split.
Yeah, so it's basically about following a director, if I may say. So we had 8 episodes, which were 4 blocks. So each block is obviously 2 episodes. And for some reason, so Steven Sergic, whom I worked with, was doing block 1, which is episode 1 and 2. And then block 2 was episode 3 and 4, directed by Sarah O'Gorman and JP Gossard doing the cinematography. And then that split between 5 and 8 instead of 5 and 6 was more of a creative choice from, the producers. And also, I'm pretty sure that the directors may have participated in that decision. But in the end, Ed Bazalgette was to do 5 and 8. So it made more sense to me and for everyone, for not only for me, but for the whole production to stay with the same director. So it's more of not a scheduling thing. It's more of a creative decision and sometimes logistics according to, the planning or the schedule of each director that makes them available this episode and another one. And then as a DP, it makes more sense to stay with the same director.
That makes a lot of sense. I think clearly there's a lot of moving pieces in the scheduling and how episodes come together, but obviously getting to work with the same director makes a lot of sense. Talk to me a little bit about the overall details of the production. From what I understand, you shot in London. Is that exclusively, or was there other traveling?
No, that's correct. We end up shooting most of it in Reading. All the action happening on backlot and studio on stage were shot in Reading at Arborfield Studio. And then before COVID, before that world, we were supposed, and we actually did some scouts to shoot in Scotland. And I remember we went there at the northwest of Scotland, scouting magnificent places. And then COVID happened. So we brought everything back. We tried to find interesting woods around London, around Reading. I mean, in Berkshire, we tried to find some nice exterior, but it became just impossible to start traveling and moving a whole crew anywhere else in the world. So the thing we did, however, is that about, I would say, early 2021, the VFX team started going to Iceland to shoot someplace, and also a little bit in Canary Islands. But yeah, we had to stay as close as possible to Reading, unfortunately.
And so from what you've said, then it sounds like you guys started in early 2020 before COVID led to the shutdown. Is that correct?
Yeah, I actually started prep in November 2019, and we started the shooting in February 2020. Yeah.
With a February start, you didn't have long until things got shut down. And so a lengthy shutdown. When did you guys start back up again towards the end of 2020?
We started back prepping mid-July, actually. So we had 4 months off, and we started resuming prep. I mean, although, we were shooting from mid-February till mid-March, right? March 17th, actually, when the whole world shifted. And then I came back to London mid-July. We had to, make sure that everything was up and running, ready. It was actually fun because the whole studio, all the offices, stages have been totally empty for 4 months, obviously. So when we got back there mid-July, I remember the electricians and the grips, they had to clean everything. And the place was like, in only 4 months, it was like if no one had been there since years, it was kind of weird shame. So yeah, mid-July, and then we resumed shooting mid-August, let's say. Yeah, something like that.
And I imagine, like every production that we talk about these days, I mean, COVID was an issue, obviously, and how you're doing the work and what can actually be filmed and number of background and such. But were there any specific COVID challenges that you guys faced? Or, like many productions, did you just, as productions do, find a way to work through it?
I'm sure it must have been extremely challenging for the production because, one of the conditions for us to resume shooting, and you have to remember it's pretty soon. I mean, we were not the first, but one of the first team to be able to shoot again. From what I was hearing, most of the other shows waited, at least smaller shows, waited September, October just to resume shooting. For us to be able to resume that early, production had to make and to apply a very, very strict protocol. So, for example, we had our own lab being able to test the whole unit 3 times a week. And the lab was inside the studio. So every morning you get parking, get out of your car. First thing you do is go and get tested. Same for all crew. And I don't even know how many people we're talking about, probably 800, 900, a crazy figure like this. So in terms of logistics and organization, must have been a nightmare. And then, of course, the rest of the impact were related to on-set sanitary measures, wearing masks, goggles sometimes. Yeah, also all of the things that we now know and that are unfortunately are becoming like habits, becoming our everyday life. It was just the same sort of thing, but much, much more strict. But I have to say, it was very, very well organized and taken care of by both Netflix and production. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think in about 8 months, I think we ended up having maybe 20 positive cases. Producer mentioned to me one day that I think they did 35,000 tests over the course of 6 months. So, we did pretty good.
And obviously the show came together in the end, but again, the effort that it takes to put together in those circumstances is extra. I know another thing that people have complained about under COVID conditions is the difficulty of collaborating where we're not able to meet as close or as often as we have on past shoots. But even separate from COVID, I'm curious about the challenges of collaborating when you have multiple directors of photography on a project. In other words, creating that consistent look. And not only in this case where there's 2 directors of photography going back and forth, but also you have somewhat of a legacy of the first season as far as the look of the show.
You're right. You do have that legacy of our first season because it's a second season. Although all the creative producers, I'm talking about, Lauren, obviously, Steve Gobb, Tomek, they were very open-minded to let the DP explore directions, and they never forced me into one direction. That it has to make sense with the character. It has to make sense for the fans. It has to make sense for the story we're telling. But we were pretty free. When I say we, I mean me, myself, and obviously JP Gossard and Terry Stacey. We were pretty free to explore stuff as long as it was for the purpose of the story. And we did. I mean, I really wanted to go towards a richer color palette and to explore the saturation and, to be just richer. And I think we did. Not that I don't like season 1, but this season you travel, the audience is traveling through different worlds that for most we haven't seen in season 1. So that also gives you quite a lot of freedom to go in a different direction or to have like a different approach. As far as working with 3DPs, it's something that I always enjoy. I had that experience the first time on the first TV show I did on Marco Polo. That's where I met Gavin Cruders and Vanya Sergio, and we became very, very good friends with Vanya Sergio, and actually Xavier Grobet was there as well. It was the first time I was doing a TV show, and I started season 1 kind of by myself, doing the pilot, and then Vanya joined the show from episode 3, and then Xavier Grobet came, and we did the whole season altogether. And then on season 2, it was actually the opposite. Vanya started a few weeks before me, and then I came, and I found it, just amazing to be able to share ideas with another DP. Just always stronger with multiple brains. So it was extremely rewarding, and it was, I learned a lot from him. And the exact same thing happened here. It's like I arrived at the beginning kind of alone, if I may say, starting prep for the first block with Steven Surgic, the director. And then very soon, JP Gossard arrived, and we started sharing stuff about scenes or location that we were sharing, gear, crew, visual approach, lenses, camera. I mean, it was extremely fruitful and interesting because, again, it's always, we would always have different ideas. Everyone has different thoughts or ideas about how to approach a scene, and it's always interesting to hear what they would do if they were in your position. And the same thing happened with Terry. It's a way to work that doesn't occur on feature, obviously, but I think doing TV series is also a good way to not to share the work, but to communicate amongst each other just to improve the results.
Well, I want to dive deeper into some of the specifics on the episodes where you were the DP. And so let's start with episode 1, which I think in some ways encapsulates this challenge we're talking about, where you're reestablishing all of the characters. You've got a lot of scenes that are almost a continuation from before, some wood scenes and some of the keep scenes and such. And we also have this set of Nevelin's mansion and everything that takes place there that is kind of a shift from a lot of the other work on the show.
Yeah, thanks for asking, because it's exactly that. Episode 1 is a little bit different from the rest of the show because it could be a story by itself. It could almost be a feature because the real journey, Geralt and Ciri's journey, actually really starts from episode 2 when they get to Kaer Morhen. And this episode, it's not a transition. It's just some sort of fairy tale that has its own flavors, even in terms of the writing, even on the paper from the beginning, it's a little different. So anyway, and it was great because it's kind of a unique episode from a writing standpoint. I had, and when I should say we, Steven Surgic, director, and we had even more leverage to explore and try kind of slightly different directions. And I always found it, because of the fairy tale aspect of it, that some of the Disney movie really influenced me. And that's the episode where I thought color should play a role, and we should emphasize the color that were already there from the production design, obviously, and the costume, amazing costume. And we should push it, we should make sure this has a different tone. And also there is a lot of, there's some sort of poetry. There's that poetic aspect of that guy, that Nivellen, that has been cursed, and he's like now half boar, half human, and he meets his Geralt. So you introduce a new character through the eyes of Ciri and Geralt, and there is a lot of humor. There is a lot of fun all around the episode. So I had a lot of fun also seeing Steven's board, because Steven Surgic is, usually does a lot of his storyboards himself, and he basically storyboards pretty much the whole episode, pretty much, and then show it to you, and then we chat and we talk about it. But all his boards were really into that poetry feel, So and especially within that house, because there is a lot of tricks and gags that are like the food dropping from the ceiling to the table, like the zootrop, like candles that are magically lit by Nivellen. And once we found an approach with Steven that we liked, because in the early stage of prep, I usually try to, do a mood board, scene by scene, or location by location, and show it to the director and producer, just to make sure, we have a way to start a conversation, and just to share my feeling and see if I'm on the right track. Steven responded very well to that mood board. So we start exploring how to shoot those scenes, and it became extremely playful, because pretty much all the effect that you can see on for example, the three scenes I mentioned are done practical. It's a combination of camera work, SFX, production design, costume. It's a real teamwork. So there's no CG there. Like the food is actually dropping from the ceiling. So we had some sort of a grid that was suspended over the ceiling, and you had 2 or 3 guys. Ronnie Raki, who is an amazing SFX supervisor, was there, and at a certain time he was pulling a string, and then you had the meat that was going down, and then another string, and you have the dessert. It was just like, doing cinema the good old way, And same thing for the candles. Ronnie had a few tricks when Netherlands turns around and Ronnie pushes the multiple buttons, and then you have all the candles being lit all along the corridor. All the rest, though, obviously, Netherlands Face is a very, very heavy CG work, as you know, and brilliantly done, I thought. But this episode, the whole episode, is a combination of how should we say artisanat in French, which is people who still know how to make a shoe, or who still know how to make a chair, but you don't buy it over Amazon, or you don't buy it to a big, huge factory. There is still guys that know how to make it with their hands. It gave that sort of feeling working on that episode, finding ways to do stuff for real. You can go that path because the poetic dimension of the episode allows you to feel not fake, but to feel a little off, just a little off. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. I want to ask you, when you're talking about the practical effects, I loved the zoetrope in that episode. I'm curious to hear how much time or effort or how much of a focus it was for you and the director.
Thank you again for asking, because I love that scene. So to tell you the whole story, it was written on the paper. And as I said, Steven started storyboarding that scene in a very precise way. And it became a big discussion about, okay, how are we going to shoot projected shadows of animated characters dancing, and that suddenly become 2 characters that are killing each other? And it's the sort of thing that leads us to one meeting and nothing comes out of it. And then the second meeting, a few days later, nothing comes out of it. And a third meeting. And after a few meetings, we were more leaning towards the VFX way of doing this. And pretty soon we realized that it would become extremely expensive, probably cheesy or not great, but most importantly, extremely expensive, because you have to remember that all those shadows are also casted over Netherlands' face, which is, his body is real, but all his face is CG. And because thank God we are not starting with that scene, it must have been shot early March, I think. So it was probably over the course of week 3 or 4. It was the endless subject during prep that we were, how are we going to do this? And then I thought, let's do it for real. And Steven was totally up for it. So I did some tests with that big, huge video projector that I don't remember the brand or the name, but all I can remember is it was maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, that kind of huge thing. You need to be 2 or 3 to carry it. That test worked pretty well. So the VFX started designing the image that was going to be projected in a very, again, like if it was coming from a lantern, so in a very poetic and almost naive way, like it should be. And then on the day, actually not on the day, a couple of days before, I did a very long pre-light. And as I knew the shots, I came to the conclusion that I needed at least 3 of those projectors to be able, when you pan from one wall to another, you need to, what you need to cover, basically, where you need to, the image needs to be projected, etc. So from the moment we made the decision to go with the video projector, it became just a technical challenges. For example, Netherlands is crossing the room, so you have to put the projector or 2 projectors high enough so you don't touch him, but you touch only the wall. And if you want the casted shadow to be on the wall, then you lower the projector. It just become a very long shoot and very technical, but it was so much, again, that's another thing that's so rewarding when you actually see the effect after all those meetings and after all those discussions, when you actually see on a monitor that the simplest way, which is doing actually on camera, and the less expensive way actually works. I really love that scene, and I have also to pay respect to the VFX works because they had to. That's the only thing that needed the help of CG World is they reproduced on Evelyn's face all of this projection. And I have to say they did really an amazing work because I myself can tell the difference. Really, it's just great work. And there was moment like the room is dark, the lanterns come down, and then the lights are on, all the projectors are on at the same time, and then he tells his story, and then before leaving, he takes the lamps, and the room goes back to darkness. That's another thing about teamwork, just about how to sync the guys from the video and the gaffer Wayne Shields. Everyone needs to be on the same timing. I love the magic moments where everything is done on camera. Oh, at least most of the work is done on camera.
We could spend the entire episode, I think, digging into specific scenes on this episode of the show. There is one thing I want to ask you about before we move on to talk about episode 2, and that is, so Nevelyn's face was largely CGI. And the reason that struck me when you said it was earlier this season, I did an episode about Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes, where the apes were largely practical masks and involved 4.5 hours of makeup to get them ready. Of course, that's 2001, and CGI has come a long way since then. What did the actor who's playing Nevelyn, what was his presence? What did he have on his face? How much makeup did he have to do?
So basically, he had everything practical except his face. In other words, he had, all the legs are big prosthetic foot of like half boar, half human, half something, so huge prosthetic. Same for his arms and hands. Same for his head. On top of his head, he had some sort of big, huge, heavy helmet with furs and everything. So all costumes, all prosthetics are real, except really his face. So from chin to forehead. And in order for him to be able to drink, speak, and for the VFX to reproduce all his mimics, all his face expressions, he had that small Moco camera, like I would say 5 inches in front of him. And therefore he was able to, and also for the other actors to be able to look in the eye. Also that camera was capturing the eye line, which is extremely important. So they were able to eventually use his own eyes, or at least having the expression and the eye line direction similar to what he had done on set. It's not a new technique because, as you know, they used it on Avatar. The industry is using that sort of technique since at least 10 or 15 years, I'd say, or 12 years. But what is very amazing to me is how much of his expressions the VFX department were able to put back on the final creature. But all the rest, like him moving, all his body language, the way he walks, the way he turns, the way he gestures, this is all Christopher. This is all him. Yeah, the only thing is the face. That also solves a lot of issues regarding interactions. Like I'm thinking about the snow, for example. If the whole character was, a guy dressed up in a blue suit or a green suit, then it becomes another big thing for interactions with, anything. He would take a glass in terms of realism and in terms of budget as well. That would be totally different when it's snowing outside and you have a flick of snow, coming to his shoulder. I mean, you can imagine how of a different job that would become without having as much of his body parts as real elements. So I guess he was getting, I'm not even sure. I think we're talking about 2 to 3 hours every day to get all those prosthetics dressed in, and it's a huge thing. Yeah.
So technology has not removed the need for all that prep time and effort into bringing these creatures to life, but it allows us to reach another level where, again, I think, and the point about final conflict happens out in the snow and all the interactions they have there. I wouldn't even thought about the challenge of trying to do fully CGI character in that. I thought that came together seamlessly. Very impressive.
Cool.
So let's jump to episode 2, where we change locations. It's largely taking place now at the Witcher's Keep. We can talk about whatever you want on this, Roman, but what jumps out to me is that fight in the basement lab where Eskel has been turned into a woodland creature. Talk to me, though, about your approach to this scene and all the different elements.
So yeah, that's another very tricky scene because again, I mean, for other reasons, because Geralt and Vesemir are fighting a monster that is fully CG, or let's say almost fully CG. So first difficulty, when you prep that kind of scene, it all starts from concepts, from production design and VFX about how the creature is going to look like. That big tree, with endless vines coming out of it. Once you see those drawings, those concepts, and you kind of realize the size of the creature, how and where it's going to move, and how the vines are going to affect the room and the characters he touches, then you start talking about the nature of the fight and the choreography of the fight. So you basically have Adam Horton, the stunt coordinator, stunt supervisor, who was coming with suggestions and previs of a fight, and then all together with Steven Sergic, we're going through beats, all those beats, and then sometimes modifying, he should go quicker there, he should hit harder there, or he should go behind him there, or the vines should grab him at this moment and not that moment. You do micro adjustments. And then comes the real question, okay, how are we going to shoot this? And there again, Steven would go through storyboards, we would review it together, and then when you get an actor, so here Geralt, who fights some vines, you need to feel that his sword is actually hitting something, otherwise you don't buy it, right? So the only thing we could find was to dress up some stunt guys with blue suits, and they had some I'm not sure, I don't know the word in English, those big cylinder that kids use when they learn swimming, those big cylinder of foam.
Oh, so you're talking about like pool noodles, I think is what we call them. What do you call them in France? Are they called pool noodles as well? Or is there another phrase for it?
We actually call it frites, which would be French fries.
Like a French fry.
Exactly, that's it, yeah. We attached those cylinders that were about, like 2-3 meters long to a stick. And basically, those 2 or 3 stunts dressed up in blue were trying to reproduce what the vines would do. So Henry would have something to hit, and that's the only way you buy the shark. Otherwise, if he was simulating to hit something, you would never buy it. So it was kind of a interesting choreography. I have to be more precise. I have to say also, we also had a previs done by the VFX guys following Steven's storyboards and all those meetings. The VFX did a previs, otherwise it becomes extremely, extremely tricky to shoot because it's a very long scene. So we knew it's even more precise than a storyboard for, all the departments. So we knew precisely where the vines needed to come from, where they were going, and also the timings for Henry and Geralt and Vesemir of where he had trained a lot with the stunts, and he knew precisely that a vine was coming from the top of the room at this moment, and then 2 seconds later, another vine. So it was about, for him, learning all the fight by heart after having watched the previs and rehearsed with the stunts for, I don't even know how many hours, but believe me, a long time. Yeah, and then for the crew members to know the fight as best as possible, just to pick up the good camera angles and to make sure it was making sense. And then again, because it's a very, very heavy show in terms of SFX, pretty soon comes the question, like a vine is gonna hit that column, for example. So in theory, that column should either shake, or there should be a little bit of stone coming out of it, or for the least, some dust. All those tricks are enhanced by the SFX department that have their own secret recipes to make sure all the interactions with what's going to become the CG monster is actually real, seems realistic. And then one of the last thing is making sure the light interaction makes sense as well. For example, there's a moment in that scene where Geralt is attached to the column at about 2-3 meters high, and there's that big vine that's holding him. So he had that old big of foam cylinder, let's call it like this, attached to him. And he suddenly grabbed the torches and he burns the vines of the creature of Eskel. He then goes down to the floor and kind of chase Eskel with the torches and burn his chest. Obviously, you're not going to put real fire just next to Henry's head and ask him to, burn the vine above his elbow. So, we came with some LED practical light gag that we put inside a torch. That's another moment where two departments have to communicate in a very, very easy way and collaborative and constructive way. So Ronnie and Wayne came up with that torches that we could adjust in color and in density and in everything, wireless. So Henry could do whatever he needed to do in a safe way. And also that would add, a little bit more of that realism because the color effect of the fire would obviously affect his face, but also the monster. So all those intricacies are all joined together and linked together. It also means you have a VFX supervisor. His name is Daddy. He's a great VFX supervisor, always on set. And, after each take, we would discuss, obviously first with Steven, but we will also circle back with the camera up, James Frater, and Daddy, VFX supervisor, to make sure that it's going to work, Again, teamwork.
I do have to note that this battle with the woodland creature in the lab, it did trigger memories of another woodland-based creature from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I'm curious how these similarities might have played out on set.
Yeah, it's the kind of theme when you shoot it, not all the time, but as opposed to a classical, if I may say, dialogue scene on those kind of very heavy SFX and CG and camera intricacies, you end up waiting from time to time. And when you wait, when a crew is waiting, there's, always someone or a few people that are going to start cracking jokes, or especially the first time you actually see that monster coming on set, who is half prosthetic, half blue. I'm not sure who that was. It probably was James Frater because that's really his style of humor. So James may have called him Groot the first time he came on set, and I must say, everyone starts laughing for a few minutes, and then it kind of stays. So when we were not calling Eskel the actor Groot, obviously, but the double became Groot for the whole crew. Yeah.
And about how long does it take to shoot a scene like that?
Good question. I need to double check, but I think we're talking about 6 to 8 days, plus a little bit of second unit for inserts that we miss, like the sword hitting a column, for example, or small tight close-ups, insert close-ups. They may have work half a day or maybe 1 day, I think. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in total, I think we're talking about around 8 days. Possibly.
Wow. And so how long do you get for an episode overall on The Witcher, typically? Or does it depend on the episode?
So on The Witcher, pre-COVID, we were supposed to shoot block 1 in about 37 days. So that would be 16 and a half days, between 17 and 18 days per episode, which is a pretty good amount of days for a TV show. And then COVID happened. So because of all those protocols, the days had to be shortened because, the crew has to clean all the gear after wrap. When you come on set, there is all those tests. There is no more like running buffet because you cannot have food delivered on set during those because of the COVID and all that mess. So we got some extra time after COVID just because we were getting shorter days, basically. I'm not sure how many days. To tell it to you, I think we ended up shooting Blood 1 in 68 days, but I'm not sure I have the right to say it, to be honest, because it's like, ridiculous.
But it's an impressive commitment on the part of the production company and Netflix to give you the days you need to do these sort of scenes rather than a typical, 8-10 days can be generous on a typical TV show. But it seems like you guys really got the room to do it right.
Yeah, no, totally. It was carefully planned. It's on every shoot, you miss time, you miss money. It's like on even on the biggest shoot is the same game than on the small ones all the time, and it's normal. And I also think because you're missing time, because you're missing money, because you don't have all the time what you want, that pushes you to become more creative. And I think that's the case for every project, but most importantly, I think it's the case for all departments. The only way to make you think through stuff more is when you have to face an obstacle, right? But yes, it was very well planned, and I think I don't see how we would have made that show with a smaller schedule, to be honest.
Well, moving on to your next episode, Roman, episode 5, what struck me was the sequence around the memory tavern that then turns into a dreamscape. Then there's these visions of fire. The whole bit is very deliberate, I should say, and not just in capturing it, but in creating sort of these feelings of almost this ethereal extra space. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, Roman. You saw it on the paper originally. How did we get to what we see on screen?
I think the main thing that, or at least the first thing we start focusing on with Ed Baselgetti, the director, was the transitions between all those worlds. Not only because it's more interesting visually, but because Ed was really convinced that if all those parts were merged and linked together, like, Tris and Siri, going from one world to another, but from the same place, like a seamless transition, that would really help all that part of the episode. That would make it more surreal and more surprising. So we spend a lot of time working on all those transitions. For example, the doll Duja, because that's how it's called, that Tris initiates. She initiates in Siri's cell in Cameron. And Siri starts laying down to Tris's nap. And then when she stands again, they're in the tavern. So we basically shot the first part of Siri laying down to Tris's laps on the cell. And then we brought the bed and the carpet and, a couple of furnitures, if I remember correctly, to the tavern. And instead of doing a seamless cut, we just use a normal cut. So I think the last time you see, if I remember correctly again, the last time you see Siri on the cell, it's kind of a profile, and then you cut to a top shot on Siri, and we're already on the tavern. And because you see the bed, on the background, you're convinced for 2 or 3 seconds that you're in the same place. And then when she stands, bob, there you go, you're in the tavern. And then same thing for all their movement through the tavern. We did a long Steadicam move all around. We wanted to have as less cuts as possible to sell the previous and the next transition. And then they enter Cameron's corridor again, an unspecific Cameron's corridor. And on this one, we use some sort of a poor man's motion control. So it's just basically the Steadicam operator repeating the same move, and the VFX used the wall behind them to do a seamless cut, because it was, that part of the wall was fading to black, so it's easier to blend in and to merge with the next location. And then last example would be a little bit later in the scene, same spirit, except that we use the motion control for that time. So we are behind the girls pushing through a corridor, and until they enter a room where Siri sees her parents, and we used the camera in that corridor. We recorded the move using that motion capture on a techno crane, and then we just moved the crane to the other location, because obviously that room was on another set. And as you push a button on the crane. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically it's this: you push a button on the crane, you say play, and the crane reproduces the same move, except the beginning of the move doesn't count because it's on the previous location, and the end of the move is what you're going to use because the camera enters the room. I hope it makes sense, but that's basically all those transitions are a combination of motion capture for some, poor man's, old man's, cheat, the old cheats, old-fashioned cheats with a little bit of VFX help for others, and the oldest way also to do a trick on the screen, which is moving the furnitures and moving the people. Actually, another funny one is when they enter the tavern. So I mentioned that top shot. We brought the bed off the cell in the tavern, and the shot starts on her lying down, and then she stands, and the camera starts moving with Tris and Siri. During that time, because we wanted that shot to be a single shot, you have a bunch of guys from props who are actually getting rid of that bed as fast as they can, because eventually at the end of that shot, the camera turns around and you see that the room where the bed was staying like seconds ago is just part of, another space in the tavern. So you have a bunch of guys rolling the carpet, taking the bed, throwing the bed through the door outside because we're on the back lot, putting back a bench and chairs, and you have 4 or 5 actors entering the room as quick as they can, seating, and then pretending just that, nothing happened and they always were there. That's kind of funny trick also, that it always works. It's only a question of timings, but we use a lot of takes to make it right, should I say. And then there is that other world where Siri sees the wild hunt, and which is like, it's like another planet with like 3 suns, a very different color, this one was needed a lot of VFX help, because we shot all the horses with the riders on a beach. I can't remember where it was. And to be totally honest with you, it was actually JP Gossard who shot that for me, because I had to leave the set for a few days. And they rotoscope all those riders and they put it back in a landscape, desertic landscape, using plates. So yeah, I mean, it's funny because all those scenes, they don't last super long over the course of the episode. But in terms of shooting days, that represents a lot. Lots of location. Every places, every scene needs to have a dreamy feel and needs to feel as different as the previous one. But at the same time, it's part of the same dream. So it's tricky, but it was fun to shoot.
Before we move on to episode 8, there was something you mentioned earlier when we were talking about you still being given the room to be creative and to bring your vision. And it reminded me of the opening scene of this episode, which takes place in the Sintra prison, where they're freeing a wizard who's going to go on the hunt. Anyway, if people have seen the show, they know the opening scene I'm talking about. But there's a lot of Dutch angles, and the lighting's very distinct. The close-ups are very specific. I think there's even maybe a fisheye lens, all very deliberate decisions. And I'm curious if this was brought to you as storyboards, or is this where you get to sort of bring your creativity and ideas to how it's going to be filmed?
That's a great question, because that also I'm going to be able to relate to what you were asking earlier about multiple DPs and sharing stuff. So first, as far as, being able to bring your ideas and how your creativity is seen on a show like this, to tell you the entire truth, I watch the dailies of the episode I shoot, but also of the other DPs and other directors over the course of the shoot. I think on episode 3 or 4, I can't remember, I think it's 3, JP shot an amazing scene in the hut, or was it with Yennefer? I'm sorry, I can't remember which scene, but he shot that entire scene using a 12 mil. I thought it was so brilliant, because not only because it looked good, but it's actually Yennefer being tortured. And I thought it was so smart to use, such a wide lens, a wide fisheye for that scene, which is a torture scene, because it makes it more freaky and more dramatic. And then months later, maybe 6 months later, we start talking about that opening scene with Ed Bazalgeti. And I mentioned to him that, the scene that JP had shot 6 months earlier. And it needed also to be freaky. It's a prison we've never been to, but we discovered that brilliant character who's kind of a badass magician that you don't really want to cross in the street, and we thought how to make him even more freaky, how to make that scene even more frightening. And so I thought, I think we should try what JP did, because it worked brilliantly. And it's like 2 episodes later, I don't think it's going to be copying someone, or I don't think the audience is going to feel like, oh, again, because it's a different location, different actors, different story. So, and Ed was all for it. So we decided to shoot it like this. Now, remember earlier I said that I had to leave the set for a few days for personal reasons. And my friend JP replaced me for those days. And he actually shot that scene. It was not a location that we were sharing. So I had done some sort of a vague pre-light a few days before with Wayne Chills, the gaffer, and JP, came to me and said, "Oh, how do you want to shoot this?" And I said, the only thing that we really discussed with Ed is shooting with the 12 mil, because what I've seen that you done with the 12 mil 6 months ago is fucking good, mate. So I think it's a great approach. And he said, okay. And he shot it. And I think it's great because he shot everything with the 12 mil, but he added the touchy angle. He added a little bit of funkiness, creepiness more than funkiness. So that's one of the example of shooting a TV show with multiple DPs, and I think it's a great scene. I think he did a terrific job, and I probably wouldn't have done, any better for sure. It's also rewarding to see in your episode the work of someone else. You see what I mean? I think it's very nice. And not only because we're friends, just because I think it gives another sensibility and another approach to it.
So episode 8, the dominant scene, and it's got to be most of the episode, is where the Witchers face off with the basilisks in their hall. I asked you earlier about how long it took to shoot the Groot fight scene, if you will. How many days are committed to something like this battle with the basilisks?
Again, I would need to check the schedule, but I think we're talking about 15 to 17 days, at least, something like this. Yeah. Plus a little bit more of second unit than the Groot fight. Yeah, no, it's massive. When I say it's massive, for a TV show, having the ability to spend that much time on the scene is great. It's a blessing, and that's the right way to approach it. But it's a very long fight. It's actually in 2 locations because you have the interior and the exterior. There is so many elements, and this is obviously extremely heavy in terms of CG. It's a very VFX-driven scene. From a shooting perspective, obviously. But, it's pretty much the same way of approaching it. It's the first watching concepts from close collaborations between VFX and production design. Because the location, you have been shooting there for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you know the location. But the creature, okay, how big is it? How does it move, etc., etc. And then stunts choreography, along with VFX suggestions, along with, big discussions, big meetings involving director, VFX, stunts, camera, ADs, and little by little you come to some sort of a previs. So as opposed to Eskel fight in the basement lab, we were not able to have a previs of all that scene. We had a rough run at a very early beginning that the VFX came and showed to us, which was very interesting. But then when you start adjusting things and Ed wanted to, change a few things or change the action a little bit and change the shot, there's no way you're going to redo a previs for each modification, because that would take a lot of time and that would be extremely expensive. So it became some sort of you have a previs, you have boards, and you have also a stunt previs. And with those 3 documents, you get your way, through the scene. But it's very, very technical for everyone. I wouldn't say it's fun, but again, you end up with 3 guys in blue suits holding sometimes 2 of our pool noodles or whatever, foam noodles, and trying to, Fritz, and trying to reproduce the move of the beast. We had also a couple of very nicely sculpted green heads that were almost looking like the CG creature, but all the consequences. A creature that's moved from there to there is obviously going to cast a shadow, depending on which side of the room it is, cast a shadow on the floor, but on the actors, on everything. So the CG is doing 80% of the work at least. But you just need to make sure that you are making all the light interaction correct and as realistic as possible. It's like all the creative nature of such a scene happens on a meeting room. And from the moment we're on set, it's about facing technical challenges and trying to put on camera what we decided. But God, there is so many. There is also cable work that was used from stunt, because obviously when a character flies from one side to the other side of the room, just because he got kicked by the tail of one of the basilisks, it's about syncing the hit of the guy in blue suit, syncing with the cable that would bring the guy, the one of the Witcher hitting the column, and then again, like in the basement lab fight, making sure that you're gonna have debris and dust coming out of the columns. And so it's all those micro details. The more of it you put, and the more you're gonna buy it, and the more it's gonna feel real. And we tried to focus as much as we could on those little details of interaction. It was a very, very long fight that we needed to break, scene by scene, moments by moments. There's also all the outside, all the fight happening on the terrace with the big white basilisk. That's another example where obviously Geralt had to fight against one of the sculpted foam green heads for the same purposes, just to make sure you feel the hit of his fist or of the sword. And that's kind of that can be a little bit disorientating, because this was all against green screen. So basically the terrace is real, but all around us is green world. You have the terrace and, the entrance of Kaer Morhen's Great Hall. That's always challenging for a DP, because you just see a green screen around you, So reproducing, and to be honest with you, that's a challenge I kind of like, because because you have to imagine, and I find it challenging, but very, very in a good way. The VFX had that great tool. They had an iPad, and basically wherever you pointed the iPad, you could see how the rest of the set and the surrounding were going to look like.
Wow, really? Like on the set, you could hold the iPad up, and it was as if they had filled in the visual effects for that portion.
Exactly. It's not fully textured and everything, but you get a very good sense, a super good sense of where the mountain is, where the tower of Kaer Morhen is, and everything. So if, for example, I was to put like the sun here, I would double check with the VFX guys, that to make sure you don't put the sun behind a mountain or something like that. And that was a very, very useful toy. It's another moment of a team where you just want to make sure everything is going to blend in. And I was also impressed by, for example, the VFX department, all the surrounding. That's what you can see outside Kaer Morhen. It's actually a location that we scouted. Remember that location in Scotland that we ended up shooting somewhere else, closer to London. All the surrounding, the rocks that are there, the sky, the mountain behind, is actually a location that we wanted to shoot Blades and all the approach of Ciri and Geralt when they come to Kaer Morhen by horses, when they go away, when Yennefer, on episode 8, Yennefer and Geralt come back on their galloping horses. All the exteriors were supposed to shoot there. And because we couldn't, obviously, the VFX spent a few days doing photogrammetry in this location in order to have, I don't know how many thousands of high-res photo of the place, so they could then, fill all those green screen with the proper location. So in a way, it was frustrating to shoot against green screen, because you like, if COVID hasn't been there, we could maybe have shot there. But and on the other hand, it's kind of a cool technical challenge that I find fun. And also you have, the ability of controlling more the event because you're on the stage, so it makes it easier.
So I'm curious, when you have a scene like the Basilisk battle, and yet it's intercut with this banquet scene that is a completely different style. Talk to me about the challenges of filming these scenes, knowing how they're going to intercut.
I think the key, because we're talking about the only link between those two scenes, those two universes, is Ciri, right? So, and I think from a writing perspective and a storytelling standpoint, I think it's clear and very obvious for the audience that, she's going to between the reality where her body is like haunted by Volesmer and her dream. So because this information is very clear, I think it's about making those two scenes as look like as different as possible. That goes with the lighting, but that also goes with the camera work. For all the banquet scene and her going back to the ballroom, we try to have as much as possible kind of a very much of a floating camera style, intercut with some static shots, as opposed to all the basilisk fights which we treated like an action scene, as simply as that. Which, as you said, it's a mix of Steadicam, but we also have crane, handheld. Is the kind of scene where we are now. The audience, I mean, is very used to see a mix of styles, especially for over the course of an action scene. It probably would have been harder 20 years ago, but there's so much way to tell a story, and especially for an action scene, I find it's very easy to mix the style. But as I said, the key was to make it as different as possible. So for all the dream and the flashback scenes, we tried to stick to one rule, which was floatiness and being as wide as possible, meaning wide lenses close to the character. We're shooting large formats, so you basically see much more of the world when you're on the set, wide and close as much as possible, whereas the fight is treated more with, bias kind of lenses, and the language varies a little bit because it's about the efficiency of the storytelling. We talked also about the way it would be edited. There is also some transition that Ed Bazalgette was very attached to and worked a lot thinking about those. And some of them are very seamless, the transition, some are less, but it doesn't matter, because I think as long as you have two styles that are almost opposed to each other, that helps selling the story.
I've already tipped my hand, Roman, that I thought the series came together great. It looks great. All these various elements come together very well. But a lot of it you don't see until it's actually finished. We talk about the editing and the visual effects. And going back and revisiting the series yourself, what are your thoughts about how it all came together?
I'm very proud of it, to be honest. I think my favorite episode is episode 1, for the reason I mentioned earlier, because of the poetic feeling of it. And no, I'm very proud to have been part of that adventure. I'm glad that I also had the occasion, to work with JP and get to know Terry, and met all those directors, met, Steven Surgic, who I admire, and Ed Bazalgette. And listen, from what I hear it's when you work on a project, as I'm sure you know, it becomes very difficult to be objective, at least for a few years. But I think we did a great show. And to be honest, the most sincere of my friends, who usually have no problem telling me that, that job, that feature that I did sucks. On this one, they are telling me that they find it great. So I do believe them.
Well, I don't know where Netflix is in planning for season 3, but are you planning to go back?
No, I'm actually not planning to go back on this one, because I had other projects aligned, and shorter as well, because working on a TV show is a very, very long commitment. And I've been doing this twice in a row, 000, and that one, I wanted to come back to features and a little bit smaller projects, smaller in terms of time, duration. Maybe season 4, who knows?
Maybe season 4. Well, Roman, where next will we see your work? Either something that's in editing and post-production now, or anything you can tell us about what you're working on?
Believe it or not, I just finished a short feature directed from a longtime friend, and that's what I'm working on. And I find it always very important to change, and it's very interesting to do a very small budget short feature. I think we had about $30,000 to make it. And it's very interesting for the mind. It keeps me fresh, and it keeps me, it's important to face challenges. So that's the last thing I did just before Christmas. A few options are in the hat for next month. let's tell you the truth, I'm not sure which one I'm gonna go for. It's still in the work, in the process.
Well, Romain, I hope you find what you're looking for. Very much appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing your insights and the work that went into The Witcher. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Listeners, Season 10 rolls on. If you're new to the podcast, I'd encourage you to check out some other episodes. It's easy to peruse the entire catalog at the website belowtheline.oneword.biz. That's B-I-Z. We're also on IMDb, so you can cross-reference the film credits of my guests. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and rate us if you like what you hear. If you've got questions or comments, you can send an email to skid, S-K-I-D, at belowtheline.biz. If you're on Facebook, you can find photos and other behind-the-scenes materials at Podcast Below the Line. And finally, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Pod Below the Line. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Loyal listeners, you are much appreciated. If you're enjoying the season, please tell your friends. We'll be back again next week.